War has always changed the way people eat. For soldiers on the front lines, meals are not about taste or comfort, but about survival. They come sealed in cans, wrapped in foil, or pressed into bars, food engineered for calories and shelf life rather than pleasure. Yet within those rations lies a story every bit as revealing as the battles themselves. During the Vietnam War, American troops found themselves in one of the most unforgiving environments imaginable. The heat, the monsoon rains, the leeches, the constant tension of jungle warfare, all of it shaped daily life. And in the middle of that, there was the matter of food. What the soldiers ate often shocked them, sometimes comforted them, and occasionally made them sick. But each meal, no matter how strange or unappetizing, told a larger story about ingenuity, sacrifice, and the attempt to carry a taste of home into a faraway land. The rations soldiers received in Vietnam were the descendants of earlier field meals like the K rations of World War II and the canned C rations of Korea. By the 1960s, they had evolved into heavy metal tins that could withstand jungle humidity and long supply chains. Inside, soldiers found an odd mix of the familiar spaghetti with meatballs, crackers, cocoa powder, and the bizarre, like canned shrimp cocktail or dense blocks of compressed survival bars. It was food designed by committee, produced by industry, and shipped thousands of miles into a world that couldn't have felt further from the kitchens and diners of America. But these meals were more than just fuel. They were symbols of home, morale, and sometimes even resentment. A can of fruit cocktail could taste like a celebration. A tin of ham and lima beans could bring groans across an entire platoon. Nicknames sprang up for nearly everything: John Wayne crackers, mystery meat hash, GI dog food. Humor softened the edges of what was often a grim reality. At the same time, soldiers created their own food culture in the field. They traded rations, mixed and matched ingredients, and improvised with whatever tools they had. Cheese spread on crackers became a late-night snack. Coffee powder dissolved in tepid water became the only comfort before patrol. Even disliked rations could be reinvented, fried in a pan, stirred into rice, or doctored with hot sauce if someone was lucky enough to find it. Looking back today, these meals offer us more than nostalgia. They reveal how the war machine tried to feed young men fighting in a distant jungle, and how those men made the best or the worst of what they were given. To remember what they ate is to remember who they were: ordinary Americans, trying to hold on to scraps of normal life while facing extraordinary circumstances. This is the story of 20 meals American soldiers ate in Vietnam. Some were tolerable, a few even beloved, but many were shocking. Food that still lingers in veterans' memories decades later. Through these rations, we glimpse not just what sustained soldiers' bodies, but what shaped their spirits. 1. Freeze-dried Lurps, LRRP rations. If there was one meal that separated the ordinary grunt from the men who pushed deep into the jungle, it was the Lurp, short for long-range reconnaissance patrol rations. These meals were unlike the heavy C rations most soldiers carried. They were light, vacuum-packed, and freeze-dried, designed for small teams who had to move fast, stay hidden, and survive with little more than what they carried on their backs. On paper, the idea was brilliant. Instead of lugging around cans that clanked in a rucksack and weighed a ton, a soldier could carry several days' worth of food in a package no bigger than a paperback novel. All it took to eat was water, a canteen cup, and the patience to wait while the meal rehydrated. The menu even sounded promising: chicken stew, spaghetti, beef hash, ham with eggs. To a soldier flipping through the list, it almost looked like a restaurant. But in practice, Lurps earned a mixed reputation. They were filling and efficient, yes, but taste was another story. Many veterans still recall the overwhelming saltiness, the strange textures, and the way some meals turned into a soupy paste instead of a stew. The spaghetti, in particular, was infamous for being more like noodles floating in tomato-flavored water. Still, When you'd been humping through elephant grass all day, sweating under 90-degree heat with leeches clinging to your legs, a hot Lurp could feel like a feast. And there was another hidden truth. Soldiers loved Lurps because they felt closer to real food than sea rations. With sea rats, you might choke down cold ham and lima beans, or chew through tough crackers nicknamed John Wayne bars. But with Lurps, you had at least the illusion of variety, of a warm meal you could sit with, even if it tasted nothing like mom's cooking back home. Some men even traded away extra ammo or prized cigarettes just to get their hands on Lurps. Others hoarded the better flavors, like beef stew, while pawning off the dreaded scrambled eggs to whoever was desperate enough. In the field, food became a kind of currency, and the Lurp rations, lightweight, practical, and rare, were among the most valuable. Of course, there was a darker side. In a humid Vietnamese jungle, water was often scarce or unsafe. That meant a soldier might be forced to eat his Lurp half rehydrated, choking down crunchy bits of freeze-dried meat and stiff noodles. And because they were so salty, Lurps often left men more thirsty than before. A cruel trade-off in an environment where every drop of clean water mattered. Still, when veterans today recall the meals that kept them alive, Lurps come up again and again. They weren't gourmet, but they were a symbol of survival. A meal that fit in your pack, kept you going, and gave you one moment of comfort in a war where comfort was hard to find. And while Lurps might have been the food of reconnaissance men, the rest of the Army and Marines had to make do with something far heavier, far less glamorous. The R2, canned spaghetti with meatballs. When most people think of spaghetti and meatballs, they imagine a steaming plate in a cozy kitchen, the smell of garlic bread nearby, maybe even a Sunday dinner at home. But for soldiers in Vietnam, spaghetti with meatballs came in the form of a heavy, olive drab can, part of the military's sea ration lineup. On the surface, it sounded comforting, a taste of Italian-American tradition in the middle of a war zone. For many draftees, it reminded them of meals they'd grown up with. The name alone was enough to spark a flicker of nostalgia. But the reality inside that can was something else entirely. Once pried open with a P-38 can opener, the tiny tool every GI carried on his dog tags, the contents often looked more like orange sludge than pasta. The noodles were soft to the point of disintegration. The sauce was overly salty and metallic from sitting in a tin for years. And the meatballs? Many veterans remember them as spongy, rubbery spheres that tasted faintly of beef, but more often of preservatives. One soldier joked that they were meatballs in name only. Still, compared to the universally despised ham and lima beans, the spaghetti wasn't the worst option. In fact, some soldiers considered it one of the better sea rats, mostly because it was edible, hot, or cold. Out on patrol, there wasn't always time to fire up heat tablets or boil water. Men would eat it straight from the can, sometimes squeezing the contents out like dog food. If you were lucky enough to heat it properly, it did resemble a meal, if only faintly. What made the spaghetti ration significant wasn't the taste, but the psychological comfort it offered. Even in its mushy, watered-down form, it was familiar. For a young private from New Jersey or Chicago, it carried a ghost of home. That mattered in a place where everything else, the climate, the language, the food outside the base, felt alien. But as with all rations, there were side effects. The sauce was so acidic that it sometimes upset soldiers' stomachs, especially when eaten cold. And because these cans often sat in storage for years before reaching the field, the flavor could vary wildly. Some meals were tolerable, others downright inedible. It was a gamble every time you cracked one open. There were also small moments of ingenuity. Soldiers would sometimes save crackers or bread from other rations to scoop up the spaghetti, turning it into a makeshift meal instead of a gloopy mess. Others mixed it with cheese spread or hot sauce if they could get their hands on it, improving the taste just enough to make it enjoyable. In the end, canned spaghetti with meatballs became one of those foods that soldiers remembered with mixed feelings. It wasn't great, but it wasn't terrible either. In the world of Vietnam rations, that counted as a win. It was one of the few meals that could, on a good day, remind a weary soldier of a kitchen table half a world away. And if spaghetti was a meal that gave a sliver of comfort, the next ration on our list stripped that comfort away entirely. 3. Compressed survival bars. Among all the strange foods soldiers encountered in Vietnam, few were as bare bones and as dreaded as the compressed survival bar. Unlike the canned meals or even the freeze-dried rations, these weren't designed to comfort or satisfy. They were engineered for one thing only: to keep a soldier alive when everything else failed. Packed into survival kits for aviators, reconnaissance teams, and sometimes infantry units, the bars were dense, beige-colored blocks of pressed wheat, sugar, and fat. They looked more like oversized dog biscuits than food, and the taste lived up to the appearance: chalky, bland, and dry enough to stick to the roof of your mouth for hours. Soldiers often described them as eating sawdust mixed with glue. Each bar carried an enormous calorie punch. One could sustain a man for an entire day, and a pack might last 3. That efficiency made them invaluable during emergencies. If a helicopter went down behind enemy lines or a patrol found itself cut off from resupply, the survival bar might be the only thing standing between a soldier and starvation. In that sense, it was less a meal and more a lifeline. Still, very few men ever chose to eat them unless they had no other option. The bars were so dry that soldiers had to gulp water just to swallow them. In the sweltering Vietnamese jungle, where clean water was always a challenge, that made them even less appealing. And because they had no real flavor, they didn't provide the small psychological boost that even a can of fruit cocktail or pound cake could bring. They were sustenance stripped to its bare minimum. Veterans tell stories of keeping survival bars at the very bottom of their packs, wrapped tightly and ignored unless desperation struck. For many, the thought of chewing through one was an admission that things had gone terribly wrong. One pilot remembered breaking his bar into tiny crumbs, trying to trick himself into thinking it was graham crackers. Another soldier recalled that the bar seemed to expand in your stomach, leaving you full but not satisfied, like eating a brick. And yet, in a strange way, the bars symbolized the harsh reality of the Vietnam War. Comfort was rare, luxury was impossible, and sometimes survival meant swallowing something tasteless and moving forward. For a soldier hunkered down in a foxhole with enemy fire in the distance, the survival bar may not have tasted good, but it kept his legs moving when the time came to run. Unlike other rations, which sparked nostalgia or jokes, the survival bar left a different kind of memory. It reminded veterans of the moments when survival itself was uncertain, when the only comfort was knowing you had just enough calories to make it one more day. And while survival bars represented the most utilitarian side of wartime food, other rations tried, unsuccessfully, to bring comfort through familiar flavors. One of the strangest of those attempts came in the form of a tinned breakfast. 4. John Wayne crackers. Every ration box in Vietnam came with a few constants: a can of meat, a can of fruit or dessert, a packet of instant coffee, maybe a piece of candy. And tucked somewhere inside, soldiers almost always found a pack of dry, square crackers. They were officially part of the B unit of C rations, but nobody called them that. To soldiers, they were simply John Wayne crackers. The name had nothing to do with glamour or westerns at first. It came from their toughness. These crackers were so hard, so dry, that it was said only a man like John Wayne could bite through them without breaking a tooth. Some soldiers swore they could be used as armor plates. Others joked that they doubled as shingles for a hut. The humor was part coping mechanism, part truth. Anyone who tried eating them plain knew they weren't exaggerating. The crackers themselves were just compressed flour, oil, and salt, baked into stiff squares and sealed in foil. They had no real flavor beyond a faint cardboard taste, but paired with something, peanut butter, cheese spread, or jam, they became tolerable, even welcome. Soldiers would crumble them into canned stew to thicken it, or layer them with fruit cocktail syrup for a makeshift pie. In the monotony of rations, the crackers were a blank canvas for creativity. Of course, creativity was sometimes the only way to make them edible. Many men recall dunking them into coffee to soften them up, letting them soak until they were mushy enough to chew. Others simply crushed them into powder and mixed them into other foods. And then there were the times when the crackers broke into shards inside the package, leaving soldiers with nothing but crumbs, which still got eaten, spooned out like dry cereal. Despite their flaws, the crackers played an important role. They filled a soldier's stomach in a way that few other rations could. Heavy, long-lasting, and nearly indestructible, they provided bulk calories that kept men moving. Some even admitted they came to appreciate them, if only because they didn't spoil and could survive the brutal humidity of the jungle. Mm. There's also a layer of nostalgia tied to them. For many veterans, those rock-hard crackers symbolize the daily grind of Vietnam. Simple, unremarkable, but always there. They weren't the worst ration nor the best. They were dependable, like a background character in the story of every soldier's tour. Still, the nickname stuck for good reason. Eating one straight out of the package really did feel like something out of a John Wayne movie, a test of toughness, grit, and stubborn endurance. They weren't pleasant, but they reminded soldiers of the toughness they had to carry with them every single day. And if the crackers were a test of strength, the next ration took the idea of toughness even further, because some soldiers swore that the tinned ham and eggs could fight back. Number 5. B unit biscuits with cheese. If C rations had a backbone, it was the B unit. These were the side items that rounded out a meal: biscuits, crackers, jams, and spreads. On their own, they didn't look like much: plain squares of hard biscuits sealed in a waxed packet, usually paired with a small can of cheese spread. But together, they became one of the most familiar and strangely comforting combinations soldiers encountered in Vietnam. The biscuits themselves weren't soft or flaky like the word suggests. They were more like a cross between a cracker and a brick: dry, dense, and tough on the teeth. Soldiers joked that they were calorie blocks or combat cookies, but compared to John Wayne crackers, they were at least a little more forgiving. What made them bearable, even desirable, was the tin of processed cheese that usually came with them. That cheese spread was nothing fancy. It was bright orange, oily, and had a texture closer to paste than anything resembling cheddar. In the stifling heat of the jungle, it sometimes separated into layers of grease and clumps, requiring a soldier to stir it with his spoon before spreading it. But when smeared across a dry biscuit, it turned a bland, chalky bite into something resembling a snack. For many, it was as close to comfort food as a ration could get. There were even moments of ingenuity with these humble pairings. Some soldiers would crumble the biscuits into their canned spaghetti or stew, using the cheese as a thickener. Others saved them to eat with fruit cocktail, turning the dry biscuits into a makeshift dessert. And then there were those who simply ate them straight, biscuit in one hand and cheese tin in the other, enjoying a simple meal in a foxhole or beside a muddy trail. What makes the biscuits and cheese stand out in veterans' memories isn't their taste. It was the role they played in the rhythm of daily life. Unlike some rations that came and went, B-unit biscuits with cheese were consistent. You could count on them, meal after meal, to give you something solid, something filling. They might not have been delicious, but they were predictable, and in war, predictability was its own kind of comfort. Still, there was a trade-off. The biscuits were so dry, they often left soldiers reaching for their canteens after every bite. In a climate where water was already precious, eating them felt like a gamble. And yet, almost every man ate them, because in the field, calories mattered more than flavor. Looking back, many veterans laugh about the biscuits and cheese. They weren't loved, but they weren't hated either. They were the middle ground, a ration that got the job done without inspiring too many complaints. In a way, they were symbolic of the war itself, unglamorous, gritty, but endured all the same. And if the biscuits with cheese were steady, reliable fuel, the next item on our list tried to provide something else entirely: comfort in the form of sweetness. For that, soldiers often turned to the one ration everyone fought to get. 6. Packets of cocoa beverage powder. Every soldier's ration kit came with a handful of drink mixes, and among the most memorable was the cocoa beverage powder. On the surface, it sounded like a small luxury, a warm cup of hot chocolate to take the edge off a long patrol. In reality, it became one of those odd little details veterans never forgot. The packets were simple. Tear open the foil pouch, pour the brown powder into your canteen cup, add water, and stir. But here's the catch. In the field, hot water was a rarity. Most of the time, soldiers mixed it with lukewarm or even cold canteen water, which turned the cocoa into something more like gritty chocolate milk. The powder never fully dissolved, leaving clumps that floated on top or stuck to the bottom like mud. Many men joked that you had to chew your way through it. Still, despite its flaws, the cocoa was oddly comforting. For soldiers who grew up drinking hot chocolate on winter mornings, the taste, however imperfect, brought back flashes of childhood. Even when it was lumpy and lukewarm, it was still sweet, and sweetness was rare in a war where most rations leaned salty, oily, and bland. Some men saved their cocoa packets for special occasions, breaking them out during a lull in the fighting or around the holidays to share with friends. There were also clever ways to make it better. If a soldier could heat water over a fuel tablet, the cocoa became smoother and closer to the real thing. Others mixed it with instant coffee from their ration pack, creating a kind of early mocha that gave both sugar and caffeine in one cup. Little tricks like these helped turn a basic powder into something worth looking forward to. Of course, there were plenty of gripes too. In the stifling heat of Vietnam, the last thing most men wanted was a thick chocolate-flavored drink. Some tossed their cocoa packets aside or traded them to buddies with a sweet tooth. And the gritty texture meant that no matter how hard you stirred, you usually ended up with a sludge at the bottom of your cup, a final reminder of what you just swallowed. But as simple as it was, the cocoa beverage powder held a deeper meaning. It represented the military's attempt to give soldiers a taste of home, something familiar to remind them they weren't just fighting, they were still human. A soldier hunched over a tin cup, sipping lukewarm cocoa, while rain pounded on his helmet, carried a small connection to a world far removed from the jungles of Vietnam. In the end, cocoa powder was less about flavor and more about memory. It was the kind of ration that stuck with you, not because it was good, but because it tried to bring warmth into a place where warmth was hard to find. And if cocoa was the sweet side of rations, the next item on our list took soldiers in the opposite direction, into the strange, salty world of tinned chopped ham and eggs. 7. Tinned chopped ham and eggs. Breakfast in Vietnam rarely looked like breakfast at home. For most soldiers, the closest they ever got was a small olive drab can labeled ham and eggs chopped. It sounded simple enough, eggs and ham, a classic American staple, but what came out of that can was something few soldiers ever forgot. The contents were a pale, grayish-pink mass with flecks of meat suspended in a rubbery egg mixture. Some men compared the texture to sponge cake. Others said it looked like pet food. Heated over a fuel tablet, it gave off a smell that was part smoky ham, part sulfur, and part tin can. More often than not, soldiers opened it, stared for a moment, and sighed before digging in. What made this ration shocking wasn't just its appearance, it was its unpredictability. Sometimes the ham chunks were passable, adding a little saltiness to the otherwise bland eggs. Other times, the whole mixture turned mushy, almost gelatinous, with a flavor that veterans later described as wet cardboard with bacon grease. Worse still, in the humid jungle heat, the egg sometimes took on a greenish tint, which didn't exactly boost anyone's appetite, and yet, soldiers ate it. They had to. A long patrol meant burning thousands of calories, and food was fuel. Some found creative ways to make it tolerable, crumbling John Wayne crackers into it for texture, mixing in cheese spread, or drowning it in hot sauce when they could get their hands on some. Others simply shoveled it down cold to save time, focusing more on the calories than the taste. Despite its unappetizing reputation, chopped ham and eggs carried a kind of irony. Back home, breakfast was a meal tied to comfort, routine, and family life. In Vietnam, this canned version became a reminder of what soldiers didn't have. Eating it under the cover of darkness or on the side of a muddy trail was a far cry from sitting at a kitchen table with fresh coffee and toast. That contrast made the memory sting all the more. Still, some veterans look back with a strange fondness, not because the ham and eggs were good, but because they were a shared experience. Everyone in the unit knew what it meant to open that can, wrinkle their nose, and eat anyway. It became a small piece of common ground in a war that was otherwise chaotic and unpredictable. In the end, the ration was less about flavor and more about survival. Tinned ham and eggs might have been unpleasant, but they got the job done. And in the hierarchy of Vietnam meals, they weren't even the worst offenders. That title belonged to another infamous can that soldiers loved to hate. 8. Mystery meat hash. If there was ever a ration that tested a soldier's imagination, it was the can labeled meat and potatoes hash. On paper, it sounded hearty, something you might fry up in a skillet back home after a long night. In reality, it became one of the most puzzling and often unsettling meals American troops faced in Vietnam. When the can was first opened, the contents looked like a solid, greasy block of ground-up meat and potato bits, all glued together with a layer of thick gravy. Soldiers immediately gave it nicknames: mystery meat hash, GI dog food, or simply Alpo, after the popular brand of canned pet food back home. The resemblance wasn't hard to see or smell. The texture didn't help its reputation. Instead of distinct chunks of potato or meat, everything seemed mashed into one uniform paste. Heated up, the gravy thinned out into an oily slick that floated across the surface. Cold, it was worse. Dense, fatty, and clinging to the spoon like cement. Some men said it was edible only in the dark when you couldn't see what you were eating. And yet, for all its faults, mystery meat hash had one undeniable strength. It was filling. Packed with calories, salt, and fat, it gave soldiers the energy they needed to keep moving through the jungle. After a day of sweating through monsoon rains or humping heavy gear across rice paddies, that block of greasy protein could feel like fuel, even if it never passed as food. There were ways to make it better, at least a little. Soldiers often crumbled John Wayne crackers into the hash, turning it into a thicker stew. Others mixed in cheese, spread for flavor, or spooned it over rice when they had access to local food. A lucky few even fried it up in a pan when stationed at a fire base, claiming that heat and crisp edges transformed it into something almost recognizable. Still, the jokes never stopped. Veterans recall pretending to bark like dogs while eating it, or passing cans of hash around with mock-serious warnings. Humor was a defense mechanism, but it was also part of daily life. When the food itself was this bad, you had to laugh to keep from gagging. Over time, mystery meat hash became one of the middle-tier rations. Soldiers didn't despise it with the same venom reserved for ham and lima beans, but nobody asked for seconds either. It sat in that strange category of meals you endured, not enjoyed. Looking back, many veterans remember it less for its taste than for what it represented. The gap between the comforting names printed on ration labels and the reality inside those cans. It was a reminder that in war, even food came with its own brand of deception. 9. Canned shrimp cocktail. Of all the rations American soldiers ate in Vietnam, few sparked as much surprise as the little can labeled shrimp cocktail. At first glance, it seemed almost unreal. In the middle of a sweltering jungle, half a world away from home, the USS Stat military was handing out what looked like a fancy appetizer straight off a restaurant menu. Inside the can, though, reality hit hard. The shrimp were tiny, rubbery, and floating in a reddish cocktail sauce that had a sharp, vinegary bite. Fresh seafood, this was not. More often than not, the shrimp carried the metallic tang of the tin and a faint odor that made soldiers wrinkle their noses. Some joked that the real cocktail part was imagining you were eating it with a cold martini instead of lukewarm canteen water. Still, shrimp cocktail had a strange place in the ration hierarchy. For many, it was a welcome break from the endless cans of ham, beef, or mystery hash. Even if the shrimp were chewy and the sauce too strong, it was different. And in a war where every day could feel the same, that difference counted. Some soldiers even traded for it, happy to gamble on the novelty of seafood in the jungle. But others wouldn't touch it. The heat and humidity made canned shrimp a risky proposition, and more than a few men swore they got sick after eating it. Word spread fast in the field, and once a ration earned a bad reputation, it was hard to shake. One veteran recalled tossing the can straight into the trash every time he found it in his kit, saying, "I wasn't about to eat seafood from a can while sweating in 100 degrees." There were also creative twists. Soldiers sometimes drained off the cocktail sauce and mixed the shrimp into rice they'd traded for with locals. Others stirred it into hash or spread it on crackers to make it last longer. When shared among a squad, it could almost feel like a special occasion, strange, salty, and slightly off, but at least a break from the monotony. Looking back, canned shrimp cocktail stands out less for its flavor than for its sheer oddity. It was the kind of ration that made soldiers shake their heads and ask, "Who thought this was a good idea?" Yet in its own way, it captured the contradictions of the war effort. Here were young men fighting in rice paddies and jungles, yet being served a dish more at home in a mid-century cocktail party. For veterans, the memory of that can still lingers. Some laugh about it, some shudder, but all agree it was one of the most unexpected things you could find in a combat ration. And if shrimp cocktail was the ration that shocked soldiers with its strangeness, the next item brought a very different kind of surprise. Hard, sweet candy discs that were meant to lift morale but often melted into sticky disasters in the Vietnamese heat. 10. Sea ration candy discs. Not every item in a Vietnam ration was about calories or protein. Some were meant purely for morale, little reminders that sweetness still had a place in a world dominated by mud, sweat, and fear. That's where the candy discs came in. Small, round pieces of chocolate or toffee tucked into sea rations. On the surface, they looked like a treat. Soldiers tearing into a ration box often hoped to find a packet of M&Ms, Charms candies, or even a plain chocolate disc sealed in foil. For a young GI far from home, just seeing candy was enough to spark a flash of nostalgia. Halloween nights, corner stores, or movie theaters back in the States. For a few minutes, it felt like a connection to civilian life. But the jungles of Vietnam were not kind to chocolate. In the suffocating heat, those little discs often melted into goo before a soldier could even open them. By the time the wrapper was peeled back, what should have been a smooth piece of candy was a sticky, half-liquid mess. Soldiers joked that the candy should be labeled chocolate soup. The Army tried to solve this problem by issuing heat-resistant chocolate, a recipe that held its shape but came at a price. It was so bitter and waxy that it barely tasted like chocolate at all. Many soldiers tossed it aside, saying it was like chewing on a brown crayon. Others used it as a kind of barter item, trading it to locals or passing it off to buddies who didn't mind. Still, when the candy held up, it was treasured. A single chocolate disc could be enough to lift spirits during a miserable patrol or serve as a small celebration after making it back to base. Some soldiers saved them for special days like Christmas or birthdays, sharing them with their squad as a way of marking the occasion. A tiny piece of sweetness could take on outsized meaning in a place where every day blurred together. The hard candies, like charms, were another story. They survived the heat better, but quickly earned a cursed reputation. Superstitious soldiers claimed that eating a lemon-flavored charm was guaranteed to bring rain on patrol, while cherry-flavored ones supposedly brought bad luck. Some men went so far as to toss the entire pack the moment they saw it, muttering that the candy was hexed. It was a mix of humor and genuine belief, the kind of folklore that spread quickly in the close quarters of a platoon. In the end, candy discs in Vietnam were more than just sweets. They were symbols, sometimes of home, sometimes of bad luck, sometimes of the little ways soldiers tried to hold on to normal life. For a few minutes, sucking on a piece of chocolate or hard candy could make a man forget where he was, even if just briefly. Conclusion. When we picture the Vietnam War, we often imagine helicopters in the sky, soldiers moving through tall grass, or the sound of rain hammering against tin roofs. But behind every patrol and firefight was another, quieter struggle. The daily task of eating whatever came out of a can, a pouch, or a foil packet. These 20 meals remind us that war is lived as much in the small details as in the large ones. For the men who fought, rations weren't just food. They were constant companions. They were there at dawn, eaten half asleep in the damp. They were there at midnight, opened nervously while listening for movement in the jungle. They were chewed through laughter, through boredom, and through fear. Some rations became infamous, like ham and lima beans or mystery meat hash. Others carried a touch of comfort, like cocoa powder or fruit cocktail. A few, like canned shrimp cocktail or compressed survival bars, left soldiers shaking their heads in disbelief. Taken together, they form a strange, unforgettable menu that tells us more about daily life in Vietnam than military reports ever could. What strikes us now is not only how unusual the food was, but how soldiers responded to it. They joked, they traded, they improvised. They turned heavy biscuits into desserts, melted chocolate into bitter coffee, and shared fruit cocktail as if it were gold. In the harshest conditions, these small acts of creativity gave them control over something when everything else was uncertain. For many veterans, the memory of these meals lingers sharper than the taste itself. They remember the nicknames, the rituals, and the way one can of food could either boost or crush morale. Food was never just food. It was a reminder of home, of the distance from it, and of the resilience it took to keep going. Today, the meals may seem outdated, even laughable, but behind every can of hash or packet of candy discs was a young soldier, 18 or 19 years old, far from family, clinging to the smallest comforts. Their rations may not have tasted good, but they carried stories of survival, brotherhood, and endurance. And so when we look back on the shocking meals American soldiers ate in Vietnam, we're not just looking at the strange menu of a past war. We're looking at the human side of history, the part where survival wasn't just about battles, but about finding strength in the everyday act of eating. In the end, those cans, crackers, and candy bars remind us that history isn't only written in victories or defeats, it's also written in the meals men shared, the jokes they told over bad rations, and the ways they kept going when the world around them seemed determined to break them.